The drums echo across the valley of Tenochtitlan. Their rhythm is not festive. It is ominous, like a heartbeat counting down to death. Torches flare against the obsidian steps of the Great Pyramid as thousands gather, their eyes fixed on the ritual about to unfold. At the center stands a young captive, his body painted, his head adorned with feathers. But this is no mere prisoner. Tonight, he is dressed as a god, offered to the heavens in both lust and blood. To the Aztecs, sexuality was not hidden in private chambers. It was sacred, brutal, and public. What might scandalize us today, what might shake even hardened conquistadors centuries ago, was to them an act of divine necessity. They believed that the sun itself required constant feeding, not just with human hearts, but with acts of forbidden desire tied to ritual sacrifice. The body was both an altar and a weapon, and intimacy was not love. It was currency with the gods. Imagine being there, in the capital city, surrounded by chanting priests. The scent of copal incense fills the air, but it cannot mask the other. Smells, sweat, fear, and blood already drying from earlier rites. The prisoner, chosen for his youth and beauty, is paraded before the crowd. He is forced into unions symbolizing the marriage of mortals and deities, sometimes with priestesses, sometimes with nobles. What begins as an intimate act becomes a performance, one that ends not in pleasure, but in the sharp edge of obsidian knives. The people cheer, for in their eyes, this disturbing ceremony is not perversion, it is survival. This was the Aztec world, a society where life, death, and sexuality were entwined in a cycle of cosmic duty. In the temples, virgins were guarded, not as individuals, but as vessels for gods. In the palaces, rulers kept harems not only for pleasure, but for ritual offerings. And in the markets, ordinary citizens whispered of punishments for adultery so severe that a single mistake could mean death. For the Aztecs, sex was never just sex. It was ritual, politics, and sacrifice woven together. But the truth is darker still. Spanish chroniclers, shocked by what they witnessed, wrote of ceremonies where sexual acts and human sacrifice blurred into one. Some of these accounts may have been exaggerated to justify conquest, but archaeology confirms enough to chill. The blood, murals, codices, and temple remains all suggest that the Aztecs viewed intimacy as an offering to be consumed, just like flesh and blood. And this is where our journey begins. Over the next hour, we'll peel back the veil of time to uncover the most disturbing sexual practices of the Aztec Empire's darkest ceremonies. We'll explore how priests manipulated desire to control entire populations, how rulers turned intimacy into power, and how rituals so shocking they still horrify us. Today were once carried out in the name of the gods, but what you've heard so far is only the beginning. The real horror, the ceremonies that blurred the line between ecstasy and death, was yet to come. In the Aztec world, desire was never private. It was public, performative, and carefully manipulated by those in power. Priests, nobles, and rulers understood that sexuality was one of the strongest forces in human nature, and they bent it to their will. To control intimacy was to control society itself. Priests of the great temples wielded this power most directly. They were not simply guardians of the gods. They were gatekeepers of the human body. Ritual unions were demanded in honor of deities, like Xochiquetzal, the goddess of love and fertility. Women chosen for these ceremonies were not seen as individuals with agency, but as vessels through which divine energy could flow. They were celebrated and imprisoned all at once, guarded, virgins until the moment of ritual defilement. Once used, they were often discarded, either sacrificed or condemned to a life of seclusion. But the priests were not the only ones who used sexuality as a weapon. Aztec rulers, emperors, and high nobles turned intimacy into political theater. By taking dozens of concubines, they displayed not only wealth but divine favor. Their harems were more than a private indulgence. They were tools of diplomacy, drawing women from conquered cities to solidify alliances. Each union symbolized submission, not only of one woman, but of her entire people. Through the emperor's bed, empires were bound and broken. For warriors, too, sexuality became an extension of dominance. Captives taken in battle were often forced into humiliating roles, compelled to act as lovers or wives in mock marriages before their deaths. These acts stripped them of dignity, breaking their spirit before their hearts were cut out on the temple altar. In Aztec eyes, this was not cruelty. It was theater for the gods. To conquer another man's body was to conquer his soul, and to offer both lust and blood was the highest tribute imaginable. Ordinary citizens lived under stricter codes. Common men and women were expected to be faithful, restrained, and disciplined in their relationships. Adultery was punishable by death, sometimes through public stoning or strangulation. The double standard was staggering. While the elite engaged in excess, the people were crushed under the weight of morality. Yet this too was part of the control. By binding the commoner in chains of purity, while flaunting the sacred decadence of the temple, the rulers ensured that desire itself became a tool of hierarchy. And perhaps the most disturbing element of all was how these practices blurred the line between sacred and profane. What in other cultures might have been dismissed as corruption was elevated to holiness in Aztec society. Virgins were sacrificed as brides of the gods, warriors were forced into ritual unions before death, and rulers turned their harems into symbols of conquest. Intimacy, stripped of tenderness, became a performance of power. But this was only the foundation. The true horrors unfolded when desire and blood merged on the grandest scale, in the empire's most infamous festivals. And it was there that sexuality, control, and death fused into ceremonies so disturbing that even centuries later, their shadows still haunt us. The festival of Tlacaxipehualistli, the flaying of men, was among the most disturbing spectacles of the Aztec calendar. For 20 days, the empire descended into a ritual theater where prisoners became gods, intimacy became performance, and death was the inevitable climax. At its center was the Ixiptla, the living image of the god Saipetotec. A young captive, warrior chosen for his physical beauty, was dressed in feathers, jewelry, and bright paints. For weeks, he was treated as if he were a deity, given food, servants, and women to honor him. These women, often priestesses or noble maidens, were compelled to sleep with him, not for love but for ritual. Their unions symbolized the god's fertility blessing upon the people. But there was a catch. Both participants knew the role would end in death. For the captive, the bed was a funeral shroud. For the women, it was a mark that bound them forever to the god's sacrifice. Imagine the psychological weight, to be celebrated, adored, and given forbidden pleasures, only to know that the very acts of intimacy were preludes to the blade. The crowd would watch, believing these forced unions infused divine energy into their empire. Sexuality and mortality were woven so tightly together that to embrace one was to guarantee the other. The final day was the most horrifying. The captive, now exhausted from weeks of playing God, was led up the temple steps. Priests adorned in skins of previously sacrificed victims surrounded him, chanting and blowing conch shells. The women who had been his partners were forced to watch as obsidian knives tore into his chest, ripping out the heart still beating from the body they had shared a bed with. Then came the flaying, his skin peeled off, to be worn by priests as living garments, a grotesque reminder of the cycle of life, death, and fertility. And yet, the ceremony did not end there. After the blood and screams, the priests wearing the skins would walk among the people, touching them, pressing their grotesque disguises against commoners in the marketplace. It was believed that these touches blessed crops, fertility, and sexual vitality for the coming year. What was, to us, a nightmare of gore and perversion was, to the Aztecs, a divine guarantee of survival. The scandal of Tlacaxipehualistli is not just in its violence, but in its intimacy. It blurred every line: love and terror, fertility and death, ecstasy and agony. Spanish chroniclers recoiled at the sight, recording it as demonic excess. Yet for the Aztecs, this was not scandalous, it was sacred. The true scandal, perhaps, lies in the human heart, that people can be convinced to sanctify acts so disturbing that even centuries later, they seem unfathomable. And yet, Tlacaxipehualistli was only one festival among many. Behind the temple, walls, intimacy was twisted further still, becoming a weapon in politics, betrayal, and conspiracies that toppled rulers themselves. That is where our story now turns. Power in the Mexica, Aztec world was choreographed in bedrooms. Spanish and modern summaries alike describe palatial women's quarters, where wives and concubines lived under strict supervision, less a harem for pleasure than a living map of tributary politics, with births and betrothals cementing. Loyalty priests, too, converted intimacy into influence via ixiptla, human images of gods who participated in tightly scripted unions. The most famous was the year-long impersonator of Tezcatlipoca during the month of Toxcatl. Shortly before his sacrifice, the ixiptla was ceremonially wed to 4 women, each embodying a goddess, often listed as Xochiquetzal, Xilonen, Atlatonen, and Huixtoquihuatl, and paraded with them across the city. Whether every union included sexual relations is debated, but the marriages themselves were public signs that the priesthood could bestow and withdraw cosmic legitimacy through staged intimacy. These ritual marriages echoed outward into politics. The ixiptla's wives were typically drawn from elite families, turning the festival into a pageant of noble cooperation. Their selection and protection for the festival period signaled favor. Their association with the god conferred prestige on their lineages. Scholars summarizing colonial sources note that the ruler himself withdrew from public view in the final days, while the ixiptla and his 4 wives processed, an exquisite display that momentarily shifted attention from palace to temple, from king to clergy. In a society where spectacle was power, that mattered. Beyond festivals, moral law became a weapon. Nahua city-states enforced severe penalties for sexual transgressions, especially adultery, which could carry death by stoning or other executions. By holding commoners to rigid standards while elite ritual life could dramatize controlled transgressions, authorities drew a bright line. Sanctioned intimacy, under priestly and palatial oversight, was sacred. Unsanctioned intimacy was a crime against social order. That asymmetry kept households compliant and preserved the aura of the temple. At court, rumor and reputation were as lethal as blades. Entertainers, sometimes labeled ahuianime, pleasure women, appear in colonial descriptions. Modern interpreters caution that calling them sacred prostitutes can be misleading. Some were entertainers attached to houses of song and dance, not brothels in the European sense, but their proximity to warriors and nobles meant songs, flirtations, and gifts could pivot into factional gossip, advantage, or downfall. A whispered liaison could justify purges or prosecutions under moral law, particularly when rivals wished to stain an opponent's household honor. Even the empire's strongest men were folded into this economy of desire. Later retellings credit Moctezuma II, with many wives and children, figures that, whether precise or rhetorical, underline how sexual fecundity projected political vigor. The palace's ability to manage dozens of high-status unions was itself a spectacle of order, and a reminder that intimacy flowed downward from the throne. In the Mexica capital, then, seduction rarely looked like a private affair. It was a liturgy of alliances, punishments, and appearances. A script in which priests staged divine marriages, rulers exchanged daughters as treaties, and moral law drew blood to protect the stage. But when spectacle turns into hubris, courts crack. The moment came when ritual, rumor, and Spanish steel collided, when a festival meant to display cosmic order instead ignited collapse. The turning point was coming. For all the grandeur of the temples and the shocking ceremonies of the elite, the everyday lives of the Aztec people were also shaped by intimacy taboos, and punishments. If ritual sexuality was a tool of control at the top, ordinary citizens bore the weight of its consequences below. Marriage was the cornerstone of Aztec society. Common men and women entered unions arranged by family matchmakers, often sealed by elaborate ceremonies involving shared meals, gifts, and symbolic acts like tying garments together to represent binding lives. But while these marriages reflected affection and loyalty, they also carried the force of law. Fidelity was demanded, and the consequences for betrayal were devastating. An adulterous woman could be strangled or stoned to death. A man caught cheating might face the same fate, or in some cases, public humiliation and execution. In the bustling markets of Tenochtitlan, gossip about scandalous affairs was not just idle chatter. It could mean life or death. Slavery, too, had a sexual dimension. While many slaves served in households or fields, some were taken as concubines, their bodies offered as property to masters or even gifted to temples. Unlike elites who claimed divine sanction for their harems, slaves had no choice. Their intimacy was ownership, their offspring absorbed into households that claimed them. To the Aztecs, this was not exploitation. It was simply another thread in the fabric of hierarchy. For women of the common classes, gender roles were strict but revered. They were seen as vessels of fertility, central to family honor, but also bound to obedience. Virginity before marriage was guarded fiercely, and rumors of impurity could destroy a woman's prospects or lead to severe punishment. By contrast, noble women chosen for ritual service were elevated as sacred brides of gods, paradoxically worshipped and doomed. Where one girl's virtue meant family survival, another's body might be consumed in temple rites. Men were not spared from expectations. Young warriors were often subjected to initiation rituals that linked sexual control with military readiness. To fight and to restrain oneself were both marks of manhood. Yet, as with so much in Aztec culture, the rules bent for elites. A farmer could die for adultery, while a ruler's concubinage was sanctified as divine duty. Daily life, then, carried a tension that ordinary people could not ignore. Behind the rhythm of planting and trading lay the fear of transgression, the weight of moral codes designed to preserve social order. And all the while, citizens lived under the looming spectacle of festivals that blurred the boundaries of sacred, duty, and forbidden desire. Watching captives forced into sexual rites before sacrifice, commoners were reminded that their own desires were dangerous unless sanctioned by priests or rulers. This double standard preserved control. Ordinary families learned obedience bound by fear of punishment. The elite flaunted exception, cloaking excess in sacred ritual. And so, sexuality in Aztec society was not only a matter of private conduct, it was a daily reminder of who ruled, who obeyed, and what gods demanded. But even such rigid systems cannot hold forever. When indulgence and excess tipped the balance, when ritual acts spiraled into corruption and scandal, the empire itself began to fracture. This was the turning point. For centuries, the Aztec Empire balanced on a knife's edge between sacred order and terrifying spectacle. Their rituals, bloody, intimate, and theatrical, were justified as cosmic necessity. But there always comes a point when spectacle becomes excess, when sacred practice slides into corruption. For the Mexica, that moment arrived in the twilight, years of their empire. By the early 1500s, the power of the priesthood and the grandeur of the festivals had reached extremes. Some ceremonies shocked even fellow Nahua allies, who whispered of excess behind guarded doors. In the reign of Moctezuma II, the divide between the elite and the commoners widened. While ordinary citizens faced death for adultery, the palace overflowed with concubines and ritual unions performed in the name of gods. To the faithful, it seemed the priests and rulers were feeding more on human fear than divine will. The Spanish arrival sharpened this tension. Chroniclers like Bernal Diaz del Castillo described ceremonies in which blood and intimacy merged, in ways that horrified European eyes. They saw women dedicated to temple service, captives forced into humiliating rites, and festivals where sexuality was staged before sacrifice. Whether exaggerated or not, these accounts circulated quickly, painting the Aztec capital as a place of demonic indulgence. To Spanish ears, this was proof of moral decay, and to justify conquest, they used these tales as weapons. Yet it wasn't just outsiders who saw the danger. Some within the empire resisted. Families protested when daughters were taken for temple service. Allied city-states, already resentful of Tenochtitlan's dominance, pointed to the shocking ceremonies as signs that the empire had lost its balance. What was once sacred spectacle began to look like exploitation, and cracks appeared in the facade of divine order. One story survives of noblewomen who resisted their roles in a ritual marriage, refusing to be bound to a god impersonator doomed for sacrifice. The punishment was swift and brutal, public humiliation followed by death. But the tale spread, whispered in marketplaces and homes, fueling quiet discontent. For a society built on obedience to the gods, the idea that people would defy ritual was unthinkable. Yet it was happening. When Hernán Cortés marched into Tenochtitlan, he and his men did not simply fight with steel and gunpowder, they fought with morality. They pointed to the excess of Aztec sexual sacrificial rites as proof that the empire was corrupt, deserving to fall. And tragically, but the fall of the Aztecs did not erase their legacy. Their forbidden practices, their sacred scandals, and their shocking ceremonies echoed long after the empire was gone. And the consequences would shape history in ways few could have imagined. The collapse of the Aztec Empire was not just a story of steel, disease, and foreign invasion. It was also a story of how cultural practices, soaked in taboo, ritual, and blood, left scars that would echo across centuries. The disturbing sexual rites and sacrificial unions that had once bound the empire together became, in its downfall, the very symbols used to define and destroy it. For the Aztecs themselves, the consequences were immediate and brutal. The Spanish conquest dismantled the great temples, silenced the drums, and outlawed the rituals that had once animated the cosmos. Sexual practices once sanctified by priests were now branded as sins of the devil. Virgins who had been destined as brides of gods were suddenly told they were impure in the eyes of Christ. Warriors once exalted for their unions with sacrificial captives were condemned as savages. What had been sacred for generations was reduced overnight to shame. But the consequences stretched further. Spanish chroniclers, Cortés's letters, Bernal Díaz's memoirs, and the friars' reports recorded the sexual sacrificial rituals of the Aztecs in lurid detail, often exaggerating them to justify conquest. They needed Europe to see the Mexica not as a proud civilization, but as a corrupt one, broken by excess. The accounts of ritual unions before sacrifice, of women consecrated then discarded, became propaganda. Whether entirely accurate or embellished, they painted the Aztecs as a people undone by lust and blood, their destruction framed as moral necessity. Yet archaeology complicates this picture. Codices, murals, and skeletal remains confirm elements of the rituals, captives adorned as gods, evidence of sacrifice tied to fertility, even depictions of unions that blurred the line between human and divine. These records suggest that while the Spanish may have sensationalized, they did not invent the practices outright. The horror was real, but so was the cultural logic that sustained it. For the Aztecs, these acts were not perverse. They were cosmic duty, necessary to feed the sun and ensure the survival of the world. In the long term, the Aztecs' forbidden rites became part of a darker legacy, the demonization of indigenous peoples. European colonizers across the Americas pointed to Aztec ceremonies as proof that native cultures were corrupt and required salvation. The sexual rituals, in particular, became easy targets. Even centuries later, writers would describe them as proof of a civilization lost to sin. What had once been sacred cosmology became a cautionary tale of barbarism. But history is rarely so simple. Modern scholars argue that the Aztec sexual sacrificial rites, however disturbing, reveal the depth of their religious devotion, their belief that survival itself demanded human intimacy and blood. To dismiss them as barbaric is to ignore the complexity of a society where every kiss, every union, every death was woven into the cosmic fabric. The impact endures. Today, the ruins of Tenochtitlan lie beneath Mexico City, but the whispers of its rituals remain. In folklore, in Catholic festivals layered with older meanings, in academic debates over truth and exaggeration, the legacy of Aztec intimacy and sacrifice still haunts the modern imagination, and so we arrive at the end of the cycle. But before we close, one final question must be asked. What do these dark practices mean for us today? The conclusion will tie the threads of past and present, revealing how the forbidden shadows of the Aztecs still reach into our world. The torches have burned out. The drums are silent. The empire of the Mexica is long gone, its temples toppled, its rituals buried beneath the streets of Mexico City. Yet the echoes of their darkest ceremonies linger, not just in history books or museum codices, but in the way we still wrestle with the same forces of power, desire, and control. We began with shocking rituals, captives dressed as gods, unions staged in public, intimacy twisted into sacrifice. We uncovered how priests manipulated desire to hold a city in thrall, how emperors used concubines and ritual wives as tools of diplomacy, how ordinary people lived under double standards that punished them for what their rulers performed with impunity. And we saw how, when taken too far, these ceremonies no longer united an empire but fractured it, giving allies and enemies alike reasons to turn against the Mexica. The Spanish conquest ended the practices, but did not end the fascination. To Europeans, the Aztecs became the ultimate example of how lust and blood could corrupt a people. Their accounts demonized the rituals, sometimes accurately, often exaggeratedly, to justify conquest. And in doing so, they created a narrative that has lasted for centuries. The Aztecs as barbaric, their sexuality as monstrous. But as archaeology reminds us, the truth was far more complex. These practices, however disturbing, were rooted in a belief system that saw human desire as inseparable from cosmic survival. Why does this matter to us today? Because history has a way of reflecting our present. The Aztecs' use of sexuality as power has modern echoes, in political scandals, in cults that demand submission, in governments that regulate intimacy for control. When we hear of forbidden relationships that topple leaders, of scandals that shift public faith, we are hearing faint shadows of a story as old as empire itself. The stage has changed, the costumes are modern, but the play is familiar. And there are still unanswered mysteries. Were the most lurid accounts true, or the product of Spanish propaganda? How many rituals were symbolic, and how many literal? What did the common people truly think as they watched intimacy and death entwined on temple steps? These questions remind us that history is not a sealed tomb, it is a labyrinth of half-buried truths. So we are left with the same haunting dilemma the Aztecs once faced. When intimacy becomes power, when desire becomes ritual, who controls the body, and who pays the price? And now, I leave you with this. If you had stood in the crowd at Tenochtitlan, would you have seen piety or perversion? Would you have joined the chant or turned away in horror? History is filled with secrets, and we have only scratched the surface. So I ask you, what other empire's forbidden truths should we uncover next? Because the darkest ceremonies of the past still whisper to us, daring us to look deeper, daring us to ask, what else lies hidden in the shadows of history?